Imagine yourself walking through a medieval town square. The cobblestones are slick with morning dew. Chickens dart across the streets, and the air is heavy with the smell of smoke, sweat, and spices. You hear the sound of bells marking the opening of the market, the great meeting place of peasants, merchants, nobles, and beggars alike. He smiles at you, gestures toward his cloth, salt, or honey, and swears upon God that his prices are fair. But beneath his polite nod lies 1,000 tricks honed over generations. For in medieval markets, fairness was rare, and cheating was both an art and a survival skill. The story of medieval merchants is not one of glorious trade routes and exotic silks. It is the story of short measures, watered-down wine, false weights, and laws written but rarely enforced. To truly understand how ordinary people survived in such a world, you must look closer at the small, boring details of everyday fraud. The medieval market was supposed to be regulated by law. Kings and councils declared that weights and measures must be standardized, and stalls were often inspected by officials. But in practice, merchants had dozens of ways to trick their customers. A baker might use a scale that appeared balanced, but the beam was weighted ever so slightly to his favor. A cloth seller could fold his wool in such a way that half an inch disappeared with every yard. These were not dramatic crimes. They were invisible cheats, small enough to escape notice, but great enough to feed a family. And yet, everyone knew. Peasants whispered to each other which merchants were trustworthy, and which stalls always seemed to run short. The honest merchant was respected, but rarely rich. The dishonest one lived better, at least until his tricks were discovered. Wine was precious, beer was common, and both were easy to stretch. A merchant might water down his barrels, sometimes by half, sometimes more. Spices could disguise the taste. Honey could mask the thinness. In some towns, this was so common that tavern owners simply expected it, and so did their customers. Guilds tried to enforce purity, but guild masters themselves often turned a blind eye if their pockets were lined. You, as a customer, might suspect you were drinking little more than colored water, but unless you were wealthy, you had no choice but to buy what was offered, beyond cheating in small ways. Merchants controlled markets by limiting choice. In many towns, only guild members could sell certain goods. If you were not part of the guild, you could not compete. This monopoly meant higher prices, poorer quality, and endless frustration for the common buyer. Imagine needing wool for your winter cloak, only to find that every stall in the town has set the same price. It was not negotiation, but entrapment. The guild held you captive, and the merchant smiled, knowing you had nowhere else to turn. The most boring yet revealing detail of all. People tolerated it. They complained, yes, but they bought anyway. Why? Because survival demanded it. Peasants could not afford to travel to another town for better prices. Merchants had influence with councils and guilds, meaning laws against fraud were enforced selectively, and often the very officials meant to enforce honesty were themselves merchants, or deeply indebted to them. Cheating was not just a crime of the individual, it was the structure of the market itself. From time to time, dramatic trials were held. A merchant accused of short measures could be fined, or even placed in the pillory for public shame. Bakers were punished if their loaves weighed less than they should. There were even famous cases where barrels of watered-down wine were smashed in the square. But the punishments were inconsistent, the inspections irregular, and the cheats continued. For every barrel destroyed, 10 more passed unnoticed, and so the story repeats. Merchants cheated, peasants grumbled, officials pretended to enforce. Life went on, built on small dishonesty, as you stand in that medieval marketplace, listening to the cries of sellers and the clink of coins. You must wonder, did the merchants truly believe their survival depended on cheating, or did they simply enjoy the game? You must picture the guild hall, a stone building rising above the market square. Inside, long tables are covered with parchment rolls and wax seals, each document recording a set of rules that merchants were supposed to follow. Guilds claimed to protect the public from fraud. They promised fair prices, good quality, and honest weights. But in reality, guilds often protected the merchants themselves, not their customers. If a foreign trader brought goods into town, the guild might force him to sell only to guild members, who then resold the same goods at inflated prices. If a local merchant was accused of cheating, his guild brothers might pay the fine for him, or quietly arrange for the charge to disappear. What looked like regulation was, in fact, a shield. The guild pretended to police its members, while ensuring that its members remained powerful. Markets often had official inspectors, men appointed to weigh goods, measure cloth, and taste wine. Their presence was meant to reassure you, the buyer, that what you purchased was genuine, but the inspectors were rarely independent. Many owed their positions to the guilds, or even traded goods themselves. An inspector might perform his duties with great ceremony, holding up scales for the crowd to see, tasting the beer with exaggerated grimaces, or cutting cloth with solemn precision. Yet behind the show, corruption thrived. If you slipped him a few coins, he might look the other way. If you were well connected, your measures were never questioned. The entire inspection process became less about fairness and more about performance, a ritual designed to convince the public that honesty was being enforced, even when it wasn't. The most fascinating part of these deceptions lies not in grand crimes, but in tiny, repetitive acts, false bottoms in barrels. A merchant might create a shallow false layer at the base of a barrel, so that it appeared full while actually holding less. Light loaves of bread, bakers sometimes shaved off ounces, gambling that no one would bother to weigh them. Mixed spices, expensive pepper might be bulked out with pebbles, ground olive stones, or even sheep dung. Yes, people ate it, knowingly or not. Dyes watered down, cloth dyers stretched their colors with cheap additives. So the vibrant red cloak you bought faded to pink within weeks. These were not one-time scandals. They were daily habits. And once you notice them, you begin to see that entire medieval economies rested on layers of tiny lies. Not all buyers were powerless. Housewives grew skilled at spotting cheats. They carried their own small weights and compared them against the merchants' scales. Farmers formed informal networks, warning one another of dishonest stalls. In some towns, women were the most feared customers. They would loudly shame a merchant who tried to trick them, drawing a crowd until the man either relented or risked losing his reputation. But even this resistance had limits. When survival meant buying whatever was available, Customers could only fight so hard. A poor family might complain about watered beer, but if it was the only drink they could afford, they still bought it. The balance of power never truly shifted. Kings and councils passed endless laws against cheating. They required markets to use true weights, demanded purity in bread and beer, and issued fines for guild corruption. Yet these laws rarely reached the stalls themselves. Why? Because enforcement was patchy, bribes were common, and in many places there simply weren't enough officials to oversee every market. One year a crackdown might be fierce, with public punishments and confiscated goods. The next year, things returned to normal. The law gave the illusion of fairness, but in practice, the daily reality remained the same. Merchants cheated, and customers endured. Medieval writers often condemned dishonesty in trade. Priests preached against fraud in Sunday sermons. Philosophers warned that unjust profit endangered the soul. Even guild charters contained long sections on honesty, charity, and Christian duty. And yet merchants confess their sins again and again, knowing they would return to the market and repeat them. The deeper question is this: did they see themselves as criminals, or simply as men trying to survive in a competitive world? After all, if everyone else was cheating, could the honest merchant even stay in business? This was not just a matter of morality, but of survival. Cheating was often the line between profit and ruin. As you watch the market from a quiet corner, listening to the cries of sellers and the murmurs of customers, you begin to wonder, was the medieval market built on trade, or was it built on the careful management of deception? When a merchant was caught, the consequences could be dramatic, not because the law was strict, but because punishments were designed to make examples of people. Imagine the marketplace at noon. The town crier rings a bell, and a crowd gathers. A baker accused of selling light bread is dragged forward. His loaves are weighed before everyone, and the missing ounces become undeniable. The punishment: he may be fined, but more often he is placed in the pillory, his head and hands locked in wooden stocks for all to mock. Some towns forced dishonest bakers to carry their light loaves around their necks as a sign of shame. Wine sellers caught watering their barrels might see their goods smashed in front of the crowd, the liquid soaking into the mud as people jeered. The spectacle mattered more than the crime itself. For ordinary people, these punishments were entertainment. A man locked in the stocks became a target for rotten vegetables, insults, and laughter. Children mocked him, neighbors gossiped, and rivals took the chance to spit on his reputation. The pillory was more than punishment, it was social theater. Everyone knew that the same merchant, once released, would return to selling in the market. But for a day, he was reduced to a joke. The humiliation was meant to remind him and everyone else that the market still belonged to the community, even if it was often corrupt. Yet not everyone faced such justice. Wealthier merchants could often bribe their way out of punishment, or arrange for the blame to fall on an apprentice. In many cases, only small traders, those without guild protection or family wealth, faced the pillory. This selective enforcement revealed the deeper truth. The law was not about fairness, but about maintaining appearances. By punishing the occasional merchant, officials reassured the public that honesty was being protected. Meanwhile, the powerful continued their cheats unchecked. The cycle repeated for centuries. Merchants cheated, customers complained, guilds covered up, and punishments were handed out just often enough to remind people that cheating was wrong. But the system never changed, because the system depended on it. Trade was uncertain, harvests were unpredictable, and survival was fragile. In such conditions, small dishonesty was not just common, it was expected. Cheating was not an exception to medieval trade. It was a foundation of it. When you look at modern trade, with standardized measures, consumer protections, and corporate regulations, you might imagine that we live in a world far removed from medieval dishonesty. But in truth, the legacy of those markets remains. False advertising, hidden fees, watered-down promises. These are the modern equivalents of short measures and diluted wine. The details have changed, but the pattern is the same. The buyer must still beware. So as you leave the medieval market, stepping away from the cries of merchants and the smell of watered beer, you are left with a question. Was the story of medieval cheating really about dishonesty, or was it about the eternal struggle between survival, profit, and trust in human trade? When you imagine medieval travel, you might picture wide trade routes connecting towns, bustling with carts, pilgrims, and merchants. But these roads were rarely free to use. Every bridge, every crossing, every gate into a walled town carried a price. Travelers called them tolls, but to many they felt like legalized theft. If you were poor, walking with a sack of grain on your back, you paid. If you were a wealthy merchant with a wagon full of cloth, you paid even more. The boring detail that mattered most. Tolls were not uniform. Each lord, bishop, or city council could invent their own fees, meaning that traveling even a few dozen miles might involve paying dozens of separate charges. Picture the countryside. A narrow dirt road winds through a valley. Ahead, you see a wooden gate and a small stone tower. Two men in rough tunics block the path, holding spears. This is not a military fortress. It is a toll station. Inside the tower, records are kept, parchment scrolls listing every traveler who has passed and how much they paid. If you argue, the guards will not hesitate to confiscate your goods, or even arrest you. Some tolls were legitimate, used to repair bridges or maintain roads, but more often, the money lined the pockets of the local lord, never to be seen again. Here is where it became exhausting. There was no single toll. You might pay for the right to cross a river, then again for using the bridge, then again for entering the next town. Merchants recorded journeys that involved over 30 separate tolls between two cities. Each was small, but together they could ruin profit margins. Pilgrims traveling to holy sites complained bitterly, for even their spiritual journey became a source of income for local lords. It wasn't just the tolls themselves, it was how they were collected. Toll collectors often charged more than the law required, pocketing the difference. They demanded bribes to let wagons pass quickly. Some fabricated new tolls on the spot, inventing fees for cartwheels, for livestock hooves, or even for the right to carry certain goods, and the traveler had little choice but to pay. A man with spears at his side was not someone you argued with. For you, as a medieval traveler, tolls were a constant irritation. You might save all year to bring your grain to market, only to find your profit eaten up by fees along the road. But what choice did you have? To walk around the toll meant taking dangerous forest paths where bandits lurked. To refuse payment meant losing your goods, and so you paid, muttering prayers that your journey would end with something left in your purse. Over centuries, complaints about tolls filled records and sermons. Chroniclers wrote bitterly about greedy lords who taxed pilgrims on their way to Peekaboo. But enforcement was weak. The system survived because it was boring, small, constant, and hard to resist. No one fought a war over tolls, but they shaped the daily lives of millions. As you walk the medieval road, your feet sore and your purse lighter with each mile. You must ask yourself, was the road itself the greatest hardship of travel? Or was it the endless hands stretched out to take their share? In the medieval world, the answer to this question was messy. Kings liked to claim that all roads were under their protection, but in reality, the local lords controlled the gates and bridges. A castle beside a river was not just a defensive stronghold, it was a business model. The lord who built a bridge immediately declared a toll. Sometimes he had the king's blessing, sometimes he did not. Either way, his armed men enforced it, and the fee became fact. Even monasteries joined in. Monks, who maintained a bridge or causeway, often charged travelers for the upkeep. Some may have done so honestly, but many abbots treated it as steady income for their abbey's coffers. By the late Middle Ages, many lords did not even collect their tolls themselves. Instead, they sold the right to do so to private men, a practice known as toll farming. A toll farmer paid the lord a lump sum for the year, then squeezed every coin he could from travelers to make a profit. This meant harsher enforcement, higher bribes, and endless creative fees invented on the spot. For you as a traveler, this was the worst-case scenario. The toll farmer did not care about fairness, only about making his money back. Kings hated losing control of revenue, so they occasionally tried to standardize tolls. Charters were issued, fixing the price of passage along major roads. In theory, this was meant to help trade flourish, but in practice, the king's writ did not always reach the back road. Local lords ignored the rules, claiming ancient rights. Even when kings enforced their laws, they often turned around and granted tolls as favors to loyal nobles. Thus, the system remained fragmented. Merchants bore the heaviest cost. A single wagon loaded with cloth, grain, or wine might pay more in tolls than in wages for the entire journey. This discouraged long-distance trade, making it safer and cheaper to stay local. Goods became more expensive, towns grew more insular, and the economic life of Europe slowed under the weight of constant small fees. Imagine how frustrating it must have been to calculate profit not by the value of your goods, but by how many gates and bridges you had to cross. For pilgrims, tolls felt like an insult to God himself. The road to Santiago, Rome, or Canterbury was littered with toll stations. Lords defended the practice by claiming they provided protection, keeping pilgrims safe from bandits, but many saw it as nothing more than exploitation. Chroniclers tell of groups of pilgrims turned back for not being able to pay. Others described the humiliation of bargaining with toll collectors while carrying holy relics or crosses. The spiritual journey became a financial one, measured in coins as much as prayers. Not all tolerated the system quietly. Towns sometimes banded together, refusing to pay certain tolls. Merchants formed leagues like the Hanseatic League in Northern Europe to negotiate collective exemptions, but victories were rare and often temporary. Local lords had little incentive to give up such a steady income. Even if one toll was abolished, another soon appeared. As much as people hated tolls, there was one ironic benefit: they made roads slightly safer. Toll stations often doubled as checkpoints, discouraging bandits and smugglers. A traveler might grumble about paying a coin, but he also knew that an armed guard at a bridge meant fewer thieves lurking in the forest. This small comfort may explain why the system endured. It was painful, but not unbearable. In medieval life, that was often the best bargain one could hope for. So you continue on your journey, watching the coins disappear from your purse at every gate, bridge, and checkpoint. And you begin to wonder, were tolls a necessary evil that kept the roads alive? Or were they the reason Europe's roads remained poor, broken, and slow for centuries? For centuries, travelers muttered and paid, but resentment grew. By the 13th and 14th centuries, complaints about tolls filled legal records, letters, and town petitions. The sheer number of fees became unbearable, especially as trade expanded across regions. Merchants pressed kings for reform. Pilgrims begged for exemptions. Ordinary farmers protested that they could hardly bring their goods to market. The discontent didn't erupt in a single rebellion. Instead, it simmered everywhere, shaping laws and treaties in slow, tedious negotiations. One of the strongest forces against tolls was the rise of merchant leagues, particularly the Hanseatic League in Northern Europe. These leagues were coalitions of towns and traders who agreed to defend one another's rights. They negotiated toll reductions as a group, and if local lords refused, they sometimes retaliated by banning trade with that region. It was an early form of economic warfare, and while leagues could not abolish tolls completely, they often forced lords to standardize or reduce them. For merchants, this meant a little more predictability and slightly better profits over time. Kings began to realize something important. If they controlled the tolls, they could also control trade. By the late Middle Ages, many monarchs started abolishing private tolls, replacing them with royal customs duties. This did not make travel free, far from it, but it meant fewer random tolls on the road. Instead, merchants paid larger sums at controlled ports and cities. For travelers, this felt like progress. Paying one large fee was preferable to being drained by dozens of tiny tolls along the way. And yet, long after kings tried to centralize the system, forgotten toll stations still lingered. A ruined tower on a lonely bridge might still have a man collecting pennies long after its original lord had died. Some tolls lasted into the early modern period, tolerated out of habit as much as legality. For many travelers, the memory of tolls became part of the landscape itself. The road was never free, and they expected it never would be. Though frustrating, tolls shaped Europe in profound ways. They slowed travel, keeping most economies regional. Long-distance trade existed, but it was costly. They encouraged smuggling, as clever traders tried to avoid tolls by sneaking through forests or rivers. They reinforced local power, giving lords, abbots, and councils a steady trickle of income. They left a legacy of suspicion, where travelers assumed every journey would cost more than expected. This is perhaps the dullest, yet Most important lesson: Europe's political fragmentation was not just about kings and wars, but about 1,000 gates across 1,000 roads. When you drive on a modern highway and pay a toll, you are living in the shadow of this medieval system. The justification is the same: maintenance, safety, improvement. And just as in the past, travelers often suspect that much of the money never reaches the road at all. The medieval tolls are forgotten, but their logic is not. Roads are power, and power has always had a price. So as you imagine yourself trudging out of medieval Europe, your purse lighter and your patience thinner, you are left with the thought: were tolls a relic of greed? Or were they the price of connection in a world where every mile carried a cost? You can live without pepper. You can live without silk. But without salt, you cannot live at all. Salt preserved meat through the long winters, flavored the bland grain stews of peasants, and kept entire populations alive. Soldiers marching across Europe carried salt as carefully as they carried swords. Monks in monasteries measured it out with precision, knowing it could mean the difference between sickness and survival. Because of this, rulers saw salt not just as a food, but as a source of power. To control salt was to control life itself. Unlike luxury goods, salt was consumed by everyone. That made it the perfect target for taxation. Kings and councils imposed duties on its production, transport, and sale. The French called it the gabelle, one of the most hated taxes in European history. Families were required to buy a certain amount of salt each year, whether they needed it or not. Smuggling became rampant as peasants tried to escape the crushing cost in England. Tolls on salt flowed directly into royal treasuries. In Italy, city-states fought wars over salt pans. What looks like a dull mineral became the foundation of entire fiscal systems for wealthy merchants. Salt was a line on an account book. For poor families, it was a daily burden. A peasant in France or Germany might spend a significant portion of their income just to purchase the salt needed for food preservation. Without it, their winter stores rotted. With it, they survived. This meant that the salt tax fell hardest on the people least able to pay. Records show families fined or imprisoned for failing to purchase their required salt allotment. Salt officers searched villages, confiscating contraband salt with the same zeal later applied to smuggled tobacco or alcohol to move salt across. Europe required special roads: the Via Salaria in Rome, the Salstras in Germany, the salt routes of the Alps and Pyrenees. These roads shaped towns and markets, and where salt flowed, wealth followed. Entire cities, Salzburg, Hallstatt, Lüneburg, were built on salt mining and trade. Their cathedrals, guild halls, and town walls were financed by the same dull white crystals you sprinkle on food today without a thought. In this way, salt was both boring and miraculous, invisible in daily life, yet quietly responsible for the growth of empires. Where there is taxation, there is resistance. Smugglers carried sacks of salt through forests and rivers, dodging officials who patrolled the trade routes. Villagers dug hidden salt pits, selling their product in secret markets. Authorities cracked down harshly, seeing salt smuggling as an attack not only on revenue but on royal authority itself. In some places, punishments for salt smuggling were as harsh as for treason, yet the people never stopped. They needed salt, and they would find it, even if it meant breaking the king's law. So you hold a pinch of salt between your fingers, something so small and ordinary, and you wonder, how did this dull white grain become powerful enough to fund kings, starve peasants, and shape the very roads of Europe? To a medieval ruler, taxing salt was far better than taxing land. Why? Because land taxes could be avoided by hiding harvests, bribing assessors, or simply fleeing. But salt, everyone needed it. In France, the gabelle became a cornerstone of royal finance. It was not just a tax, it was a system. Officials counted every barrel, weighed every shipment, and demanded that every family purchase a minimum quantity, even if they already had enough. The result? The crown's treasury swelled, while peasants grew bitter. Salt money paid for wars, castles, and even the luxuries of court, all drawn from the tiny crystals in a peasant's stew. If you walked to the coast of Venice or down into the Bavarian Alps, you would find vast salt works, shallow pans, or deep mines where laborers scraped, boiled, and hauled day after day. These were no small enterprises. Salt flats and mines were guarded as jealously as gold. Wars were fought over them. Cities like Venice, Genoa, Salzburg, and Lüneburg grew rich not from exotic silks, but from controlling steady supplies of salt. Salt was power because it was boring, predictable, constant, and universal. Salt also had a direct connection to war. Armies could not march without preserved meat. Sailors on long voyages needed salted fish to survive. Every campaign required vast supplies of salt, stored and guarded like treasure. Kings who controlled salt controlled the ability to wage war. A shortage of salt was as dangerous as a shortage of weapons. For the poor, salt remained a quiet misery. Records from France describe families so burdened by salt taxes that they resorted to begging. In some regions, people deliberately ate less salted food, not out of preference, but necessity. In 14th century Germany, towns protested violently when salt duties rose. Chroniclers describe riots where peasants stormed toll houses, burning the records of salt purchases. Yet even rebellion rarely brought change. Salt was too valuable a revenue stream to surrender. Smuggling became a way of life. In France, entire regions developed underground salt economies with secret paths through forests and rivers. Smugglers became folk heroes, seen not as criminals but as defenders of ordinary people against unfair taxes. The authorities responded with brutal crackdowns. Patrols hunted smugglers, confiscating their goods and punishing villages suspected. But the harder the crown pressed, the more resistance grew. This tug-of-war lasted centuries, a dull, endless struggle that shaped local economies and even fueled revolts. More than anything, salt became a symbol. To obey the salt tax was to recognize the king's authority. To smuggle was not just theft, but rebellion. In this way, salt was no longer just about food. It was about power, loyalty, and survival. As you picture a sack of salt carried down a narrow village road, you must ask yourself, was this simple mineral truly a necessity? Or had it become a tool of kings to remind every subject, rich or poor, who truly ruled their lives? By the late Middle Ages, the burden of salt taxation had grown unbearable. What began as a quiet frustration erupted into open resistance. People refused to buy the mandated quantities, smuggled openly, or attacked salt warehouses. Chroniclers describe women leading these protests, the ones who bought, cooked, and stretched every grain. Salt taxation became so hated that centuries later it fueled revolutionary anger. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, the gabelle stood as one of the most despised symbols of royal greed. Its abolition was celebrated as much as the fall of feudal dues. Elsewhere in Europe, change came more gradually as economies grew and trade expanded. Rulers found it more profitable to tax broader forms of commerce rather than one commodity. New preservation methods, smoking, improved storage, later refrigeration, reduced dependence on salt. While still valuable, it no longer held the monopoly on survival it once had. By the modern period, salt's fiscal role diminished, though its memory lingered in old toll records, village complaints, and ruined salt towers along forgotten roads. One of the strangest legacies of the salt tax was cultural. Smuggling became normalized. Entire regions of France, Germany, and Italy carried traditions of salt runners who were celebrated in folk songs and stories. Long after the taxes disappeared, to smuggle salt was not seen as criminal. It was seen as resisting oppression. These attitudes shaped later resistance to other taxes, from tobacco to alcohol. The salt smuggler paved the way for a long tradition of tax evasion and underground markets in Europe. Salt's influence stretched far beyond the continent. In Africa, entire trade networks ran on salt, carried by camel caravans across the Sahara. In China, dynasties relied on state monopolies over salt for centuries, funding armies and administration. Wherever you look, the same pattern emerges. Salt was boring, universal, and inescapably political. To control it was to control people. Even today, the echoes remain. The word salary itself comes from salarium, Roman soldiers' salt allowance. Modern tolls and consumption taxes descend from the logic of salt taxation. And though we rarely think of salt as valuable now, the infrastructure it built, roads, towns, treasuries, rebellions, still shapes our world. So, as you place a pinch of salt on your tongue, something so ordinary it passes without thought, you are left with the reminder. The smallest grains built the largest empires and the most hated taxes. For medieval peasants, bread was not a side dish. It was the meal. A family might eat little else besides coarse loaves made from rye, barley, or oats. Wheat bread was for the rich, white, and soft, while the poor chewed through heavy, dark loaves that filled the stomach, but not the spirit. To go without bread was to go hungry. That is why rulers obsessed over it, why laws were written about it, and why the smallest cheat by bakers or millers became a scandal that shook entire towns. Before you could have bread, you needed flour, and before flour, grain passed through the hands of the miller. Milling was almost always monopolized. A village might have only one mill, often owned by a lord or monastery. Peasants were required to grind their grain, their paying not in coins, but in a share of the flour. Millers quickly gained a reputation for dishonesty. They took more than their share, mixed husks back into the flour, or ground the grain poorly. A saying spread across Europe: a miller is never poor, and a peasant never fully fed. The suspicion was so great that millers became stock characters in folk tales: greedy, sly, and always taking a little more than they should. Once the flour was ready, it passed to the baker. But here, too, cheating was common. Bakers were legally bound to sell loaves of a specific weight for a fixed price, especially in towns. But when grain prices rose, bakers sometimes shrank their loaves to protect profits. Customers weighed their bread and cried foul when ounces were missing in England. This gave birth to the Assize of Bread and Ale, one of the earliest consumer protection laws in Europe. Officials inspected loaves, punishing bakers who cheated. In some cases, dishonest bakers were forced to carry their underweight bread through the streets as public shame. Beyond cheating, bread could actually harm you. Poor harvests led to desperate substitutes: acorns, beans, or even ground bark mixed into flour. Some of these filled bellies but brought illness. Rye bread in particular carried a hidden danger: ergot fungus, which could cause convulsions, hallucinations, or even death. Entire villages suffered outbreaks of St. Anthony's fire, a mysterious sickness later traced to poisoned loaves for the poor. Eating bread was not only a necessity, it was a gamble, because bread was so central. Rulers treated it almost as a sacred trust. Town councils recorded grain prices obsessively, adjusting the official price of bread so that even the poorest could afford it. Bakers who violated the law faced fines, pillories, or worse. But these laws were they kept bread affordable, but they also squeezed bakers who risked ruin if grain costs rose too high. This constant tension turned bread into a battlefield between rulers, bakers, and hungry crowds. So you hold a loaf of medieval bread, heavy, coarse, and uncertain, and you wonder, was this daily food truly the staff of life, or was it a silent weapon in the endless struggle between hunger, greed, and survival? In medieval towns, bread was not considered just another product. It was a public necessity. Councils treated it almost like water or air, something no one could go without. This is why officials carefully regulated the price and size of loaves. Bakers were allowed only a small profit margin, and the weight of bread changed depending on the cost of grain. If wheat was expensive, the loaf shrank. If wheat was cheap, it grew. For townsfolk, this meant constant attention to their daily bread. They weighed it, measured it, and compared notes with neighbors. A loaf, even a few ounces short, could spark anger and sometimes violence. For bakers, these laws were suffocating. Imagine waking before dawn, kneading dough in a smoky, stifling oven, only to have officials inspect your loaves. If they judged your bread to light, you faced fines, confiscation, or the humiliation of public punishment. Some bakers tried to cheat, shaving off weight here and there. Others simply gave up, unable to survive under such restrictions. To balance the risk, many adopted the custom of adding an extra loaf for every dozen sold. The origin of the baker's dozen was a way to protect themselves from accusations of short measure. When harvests failed, grain prices soared. Bread disappeared from the tables of the poor. Riots broke out across Europe, not over politics, not over kings, but over loaves. Crowds stormed bakeries, demanding bread at a just price. In some cases, they seized loaves and distributed them to the hungry. Authorities feared these bread riots deeply, for they showed how fragile order could be when the stomach was empty. These riots were rarely organized rebellions. They were spontaneous, desperate eruptions of hunger. And yet they terrified rulers who understood that a hungry city was a dangerous city. Kings and councils learned to use bread as a symbol of care. In times of famine, rulers sometimes distributed bread freely to calm unrest. Monasteries handed out loaves to the poor as charity, ensuring their spiritual reputation. Even coronations and festivals often included the public gift of bread, a reminder that rulers, at least in theory, fed their people. But behind the spectacle, the system remained precarious, balanced on fragile harvests and strict regulations. Alongside shortage and cheating came another fear: poisoned bread. In cities where tensions ran high, rumors spread that bakers were secretly killing the poor with tainted flour. Foreigners and outsiders were sometimes accused of spreading disease through bread. While most of these fears were exaggerated, they reveal how deeply people depended on their daily loaf. If bread failed them, they believed all of society had failed. As you picture a medieval marketplace, where loaves are weighed under the eyes of suspicious crowds, you must wonder, was bread truly food, or was it the measure by which every ruler, every baker, and every law was judged? When a baker was caught cheating, the punishment was designed not just to correct him, but to shame him. Imagine a crowded square. The baker stands in the pillory, his head and hands locked in place, while his underweight loaves hang around his neck on a rope. Children jeer, women throw scraps, and rivals laugh openly. Sometimes the punishment went further. In parts of Germany, dishonest bakers were dunked in rivers or forced to ride through town backwards on a donkey, holding their loaves aloft as a warning. The point was always the same: to show the community that bread was sacred, and cheating, it was a sin against everyone. Yet, just like with merchants and toll collectors, not every cheat was punished. Wealthy bakers with guild connections often escaped consequences, while small-town bakers bore the brunt of inspections. Councils wanted to appear strict, but they also needed bakers. If too many were fined, bread disappeared, and riots followed. So, the system became one of selective justice, enough spectacle to reassure the people, but never enough to destroy the trade. Over time, bread regulations grew into one of the most detailed legal systems of the medieval world. The Assize of Bread and Ale in England set out exact rules for loaf, weight, and ale prices, recalculated every time grain markets shifted. Town councils across Europe kept ledgers filled with bread inspections, showing how seriously they took the daily loaf. These records, boring and repetitive, reveal just how central bread was to urban life. If you look closely, you see the same lesson. The most ordinary food required the most extraordinary control. Beyond economics, bread became a symbol of justice itself. Priests preached about the daily bread of the Lord's Prayer, tying religion to sustenance. Rulers distributed loaves as proof of care. Bakers became both providers and scapegoats, caught between the hunger of the people and the demands of the law. Even today, when we speak of breadwinners or earning one's bread, we echo these medieval struggles. The loaf was not just food, it was survival, honesty, and justice, all baked into one dot. So as you hold a coarse medieval loaf in your hands, heavy, rough, and imperfect, you are left with the question: was bread truly the comfort of daily life, Or was it the clearest reminder that survival in the Middle Ages was always measured, weighed, and never fully secure? Picture a long wooden hall lit only by narrow windows and flickering candles. The air is heavy with the smell of ink, wax, and damp parchment. Along rows of benches sit monks in rough woolen robes, their heads bowed, quills scratching in steady rhythm. This was the scriptorium, the heart of medieval record-keeping. It was not just a place for copying holy texts, but for maintaining the boring, endless accounts of estates, taxes, donations, and debts while knights rode to war and kings held court. These scribblers spent their lives recording how much barley was harvested, how many sheep were sold, and which peasants still owed rent to the monastery. Writing was not a luxury, it was survival. Abbeys owned vast estates, with peasants working fields, mills, and fisheries. Every detail, every bushel of wheat, every cask of ale, every penny collected had to be written down. Without these records, the monastery could not function, and so armies of scribes filled their days with lists, tallies, and contracts. For them, salvation came not in battle or prayer, but in the precision of inked numbers. The records were astonishingly dull. Surviving account books show page after page of entries like 2 pigs sold at market, 3 pence, 1 cloak for the abbot dyed green, 1 shilling repair of roof tiles, 2 men. For days' labor, there was no glory in these words, no poetry. Yet behind them lay the rhythm of medieval life. These lists captured the ordinary in ways kings and chronicles never did. Of course, not every scribe was perfect. Mistakes crept in, sometimes by accident, sometimes on purpose. A sympathetic monk might underreport a peasant's debt. Another might inflate the monastery's expenses to cover his own theft. This is why margins are filled with corrections, crossouts, and angry notes from superiors. The battle for honesty was fought not in the marketplace, but on the parchment itself. For the scribes themselves, the work was exhausting. Hours hunched in cold halls left them with aching backs, cramped hands, and failing eyesight. Some complained bitterly in their margins, leaving little notes like, "The hand that writes grows weary. Oh, for a drink." Let the reader not blame the scribe, for the night was cold. These tiny human voices remind us that even the driest accounts were written by men struggling with boredom, fatigue, and frustration. So, as you turn the pages of a monastery account book filled with endless tallies of pigs and pennies, you must ask yourself, were these scribes merely preserving records, or were they quietly preserving the very heartbeat of medieval daily life? Those endless lists of barley, pigs, and pennies were not just numbers. They were power. When a monastery recorded that a peasant owed rent, that line of ink bound him as firmly as a chain. When a scribe noted the size of a harvest, that number determined how much tax was demanded. Written words gave permanence to obligations that could not be argued away. This was why monasteries guarded their records like treasure. In disputes with lords, peasants, or rival abbeys, the account books became weapons. A scrap of parchment could decide who owned a field, who paid a debt, and who held the right to a mill. Monasteries were not only religious centers, but also bureaucratic machines. Their scribes produced not just account books, but charters, contracts, wills, and rental rolls. Each document required precision, names spelled correctly, dates recorded, seals affixed. To make a mistake was to risk a lawsuit or a feud, and so monks worked with meticulous care, even as their hands trembled with fatigue. It is ironic, while their prayers promised heaven, their pens built earthly empires. For the scribes themselves, the work was suffocatingly repetitive. Day after day, they copied numbers into ledgers, their only break the tolling of bells for prayer. Some found comfort in the routine, seeing it as discipline. Others left little outbursts in margins, drawings of animals, doodles of faces, even jokes mocking their own boredom. A few scribes confessed their resentment, writing that their minds longed for rest while their bodies remained chained to the desk. This is history at its most human. Men struggling with paperwork centuries before the modern office was born. One crooked number could ruin someone. If a scribe accidentally doubled the amount of rent owed, a peasant might be forced into debt for years. If a name was misspelled on a charter, a family could lose its claim to land to modern eyes. These seem like trivial clerical errors. But in a world where law was written, not spoken, mistakes in ink could echo for generations. And yet, these dull account books also contain fragments of life. A monk noting one cow dead from lightning, another recording shoes for the orphan boy, a line describing ale purchased for Feast of St. Martin. These throwaway notes, buried among endless tallies, give us glimpses of laughter, grief, and survival. Behind the boredom, the scribes captured humanity in its smallest details, as you picture a monk bent over his ledger, scratching out debts by candlelight. You are left to wonder, were these scribes trapped by the monotony of their work, or were they, without realizing it, the true architects of medieval memory? Most monks who bent over their desks never lived to see the true impact of their work. To them, the ledgers were daily burdens, soon locked away in chests and forgotten. But centuries later, those same parchments became the foundation of European history. Without the scribbler's dull tallies, we would know almost nothing about medieval harvests, taxes, or daily survival. The ink may have faded, but the records endured, more reliable than memory, more permanent than speech. In their own time, these books had real power. Kings and nobles came to monasteries, not only for blessings, but for documents. A charter preserved by monks might prove that a field belonged to one lord rather than another. In disputes, the written word usually triumphed. Oral testimony could be doubted, but parchment sealed with wax carried the weight of eternity. A single line in a dusty account could tip the balance of wealth and power. In a way, the monks invented the modern office. Their ledgers were prototypes of bureaucratic order, structured, dated, checked against inventories. Later, governments borrowed their methods: systematic taxation, precise records, centralized archives. It was boring, yes, but it built stability. An empire of ink stretched further than one of swords. And yet, the scribes themselves remain mostly nameless. They poured their lives into the work, but their identities rarely mattered. Their voices survive only in tiny, marginal notes, complaints of cold fingers, sketches of cats, or prayers scribbled between columns of numbers. These small traces are the only echoes of their humanity, a reminder that behind every ledger was a man with a weary back and a restless mind. Today, Those same account books are prized by historians. From them, we can trace prices of wheat across centuries, measure population shifts, even glimpse the rhythm of festivals and famines. The monks never intended to create history. They were simply balancing accounts. But in doing so, they preserved the texture of a world otherwise lost. So as you close the heavy ledger, your fingers stained with ink and your mind numb from tallies, you are left with a final thought. Were the monastery scribblers prisoners of paperwork, or were they, without ever knowing, the quiet guardians of Europe's forgotten past? When you imagine medieval wealth, you probably think of gold coins, silk, or spices. But in the alleys of towns and the courtyards of villages, another kind of currency flowed. Waste, human urine, animal dung, ashes, and kitchen scraps. All of it had value. Brewers, tanners, fullers, and soap makers depended on these unpleasant materials for their trades. What others flushed away, they gathered, sold, and transformed into profit. It was dirty work, but it kept entire industries running. The strangest of all was urine. In the textile trade, fullers used it to clean and soften wool. Buckets of chamber lye, as it was called, were collected from households and delivered to workshops. The smell was unbearable, but the results were undeniable. Urine's ammonia broke down grease and dirt, turning rough wool into soft cloth. Some towns even taxed urine collection, recognizing its value. To modern ears, it sounds absurd. But in a world without chemical factories, the human body itself became part of the supply chain. Animal dung, too, had its place. Tanneries needed it to treat hides, softening leather before it was shaped into shoes, belts, or armor. The stench of a tannery carried for miles. Towns often forced them to the outskirts, but their demand for waste meant that dung collectors always had steady work. Farmers sold manure not only for fertilizer, but also for the leather trade, turning filth into coin. Even ashes were valuable. Soap makers mixed wood ash with animal fat to create lye, the foundation of primitive soap. Families saved their hearth ash for sale, contributing to the economy of cleanliness through the remains of fire. It was an odd cycle. Filth was turned into soap. Soap was used to wash, and the ashes of the soap-making fire went back into the process. Waste was never truly wasted. Behind all this were the collectors, the men and women who gathered waste from streets, chamber pots, and stables. Their jobs were despised, their clothes filthy, their smell unavoidable. Yet, without them, the system collapsed. They lived on society's edge, mocked and avoided, but they held a strange kind of power. They could demand payment for their services, knowing that every tanner, fuller, and soap maker depended on their buckets. So, as you wrinkle your nose at the thought of medieval waste, you must ask yourself, was filth in the Middle Ages truly a problem, or was it, in its own foul-smelling way, the foundation of industry and survival? When the town slept, another workforce came alive. These were the night soil men, charged with emptying cesspits, chamber pots, and latrines. They carried buckets through narrow streets, slopping waste into carts bound for fields outside the walls. The job was disgusting, but it was steady. Farmers paid for human waste as fertilizer, and tradesmen bought it for tanning or textile work. The night soil man was poor and despised, yet his work was essential. Without him, the city would choke in its own filth. Urine, in particular, became a strange form of trade. Some towns set up official collection points, barrels placed at street corners, where families could dump their chamber pots. In England, even into the early modern period, poor households were sometimes paid for their urine. It was gathered in bulk and sold to fullers and dyers. The smell was unbearable, but the money was welcome, in a sense. Every household became a tiny supplier in the great market of waste. The industries that relied on waste were some of the foulest in medieval towns. Tanneries, fulling mills, and soapworks stank so badly they were often pushed to the very edge of city walls. Travelers wrote about approaching towns and smelling them long before seeing them. Residents hated these industries, yet tolerated them because they provided vital goods: leather for shoes and armor, cloth for clothing, soap for washing. The smell of waste was the price of survival. Attitudes toward waste reflected social class. Wealthier families often paid collectors to remove filth discreetly, while the poor carried their own buckets to public pits. Monks and abbeys, though wealthy, were not exempt. Their latrines needed clearing, too, and their estates depended on fertilizer, just like any farm. Waste was universal. No one, not even kings, escaped it. The only difference was who had to handle it. For all its stink, the waste economy brought profit. Collectors sold to industries. Industries sold finished goods back to the public. Lords and councils sometimes taxed the trade, quietly pocketing revenue from filth. What looks like trash became money, money that fueled trade, supported families, and even paid for the upkeep of towns. So, as you imagine the night soil men trudging through the darkness with their buckets, you are left with the thought: did medieval society master waste, or did waste, in its own way, master medieval society? As medieval towns grew into early modern cities, the waste economy began to strain under its own weight. Populations boomed, cesspits overflowed, and diseases spread. What had once been manageable recycling turned into a public health crisis. Authorities tried to regulate waste collection more strictly. Some towns imposed schedules for cesspit cleaning. Others moved tanneries and fulling mills even farther from the center. Yet the stench persisted. By the 16th century, many city dwellers began to see waste not as a resource, but primarily as a danger. The industries that once relied on waste slowly found alternatives. Soap making shifted toward imported lye and new chemical processes. Textile cleaning advanced, reducing dependence on urine. Farming, too, saw changes. More animal manure, fewer human contributions. This did not happen overnight, but gradually. The golden age of waste-based industry declined. Interestingly, waste even played a part in rebellion. In France, during protests against taxes and corruption, people sometimes hurled waste at officials, a literal and symbolic rejection of authority. Night soil, once sold for profit, became a weapon of mockery. The same material that fed industries could also express contempt. As industries modernized, the collectors, the night soil men, the urine gatherers, the dung haulers slipped into obscurity. Their jobs remained into the 18th and 19th centuries, but they became increasingly stigmatized. Few remembered that their labor had once been the backbone of medieval production, and yet the logic of the waste economy never vanished. Recycling, composting, fertilizer production. All these echo the medieval system of turning refuse into resource. Even sewage plants today operate on the same principle. Waste is never just waste. What feels dirty and disposable often hides hidden value. So as you close this chapter, you are left with one final thought. Did medieval people recycle out of wisdom, or simply because, in a world of scarcity, even waste was too precious to throw away? By day, a medieval town bustled with merchants, craftsmen, and children chasing chickens through the square. But by night, it was another world, silent, dangerous, and vulnerable, who kept order when the gates closed and the lamps dimmed. The watchmen, armed with little more than a spear, a horn, or a lantern, these men patrolled the streets, listening for fire, thieves, or worse. They were not glamorous soldiers or brave knights. They were the forgotten guardians of the dark, tasked with a job that was boring most nights and terrifying on the rare ones when danger came. The work was slow and monotonous. A watchman walked his beat, stopping at checkpoints to prove he had not fallen asleep. He called the hours aloud, 2 of the clock, and all's well, partly to mark time, partly to warn would-be thieves that someone was awake. In winter, the cold seeped into his bones. In summer, the silence stretched endlessly. The greatest challenge was not the enemy, but drowsiness. Falling asleep on watch was one of the gravest offenses, sometimes punished by whipping, fines, or dismissal. Of all the dangers, fire was the most feared. In towns built of wood and thatch, a single spark could consume dozens of homes. Watchmen sniffed the air for smoke, listened for crackling timbers, and carried bells or horns to raise the alarm. Many records of medieval fires mention the watch, sometimes praised for saving lives, sometimes blamed for failing to act quickly enough. The responsibility weighed heavily, for everyone knew that a careless ember could destroy a community overnight. Watchmen were also tasked with keeping order. Strangers out after dark were stopped and questioned. Known troublemakers were watched closely. In some towns, curfews were enforced. Anyone caught wandering without a lantern risked arrest. These small acts of control irritated some, but they kept towns safer. The watchman was both protector and nuisance, both servant and authority. What did a watchman think as he paced through empty streets? The surviving records suggest boredom, loneliness, and resentment. Songs and poems from the time sometimes mock them as half-asleep drunks, muttering through their shifts. Yet their presence mattered. Most nights, nothing happened. But on the nights when something did, when thieves struck, when flames rose, when enemies crept near the walls, the watchman was the first line of defense. So, as you picture a cloaked figure walking through a silent medieval town, lanterns swinging in the dark, you must ask, was the watchman a true guardian of the people, or just another weary soul marking time, praying for dawn? The watch was not glamorous work, and it was rarely voluntary. In many towns, ordinary citizens were required by law to serve in rotation. A butcher might find himself pacing the streets one week, a carpenter the next. Wealthier citizens often paid substitutes, poor men willing to endure the long hours for a few coins. This created a curious mix: old men with aching joints, young men eager for pay, and sometimes even criminals pressed into service. What united them was fatigue, boredom, and the knowledge that no one thanked the night watch when nothing happened. The system varied from town to town, but most divided the night into shifts, with patrols assigned to certain streets or sections of the wall. Hourly calls. Watchmen were expected to announce the time loudly enough for citizens to hear. This reassured the town and proved they were awake. Checkpoints. Officials sometimes left hidden markers that watchmen had to collect during patrols, ensuring they had walked their route. The watch house. Each town had a small building where men gathered at the start of their shift, receiving assignments and torches before dispersing into the streets. It was bureaucracy at its most tedious, yet it created a fragile order in the sleeping city. Watchmen carried only the simplest tools: a lantern or torch to light their way, a spear or staff for protection, a horn or bell to sound alarms. They were not equipped for battle. Their strength lay in raising the cry, summoning townsfolk or militias when real danger came. In this sense, they were less defenders than living alarm systems. Curfew laws gave the watchmen authority. When the evening bell rang, fires were to be covered, shops closed, and people indoors. Anyone wandering without permission risked arrest. To modern eyes, this seems oppressive, but in towns of timber and thatch, curfew was a matter of survival. Fires started by a single careless candle could destroy everything. The watch enforced these laws with sternness, and many resented them for it. Despite their importance, watchmen were often ridiculed. Plays and poems depict them as half-asleep drunks, leaning on spears while thieves slipped past. In truth, some surely lived up to the stereotype, but the mockery itself shows how little respect the job carried. And yet, when disaster struck, all eyes turned to them. Their thankless role became visible only in failure. So, as the hours pass and the watchman calls the time into the night, you must ask, was the night watch a true system of protection, or simply a ritual, a performance of safety in a world that was never truly safe? The watchman's job was simple: stay awake, keep order, and raise alarms. But failures were inevitable. Fires that spread too fast for bells to summon, help thieves, patrols, enemies who scaled walls under the cover of darkness. Chroniclers often blamed watchmen for disasters, accusing them of negligence. Entire towns cursed them when catastrophe struck. Yet few asked how realistic it was for half-trained, poorly armed citizens to hold back chaos in the night. Nothing was more shameful than a watchman caught asleep on duty. Punishments were severe: public whipping, fines, or dismissal from service. The reasoning was clear: one man's drowsiness could mean a city's destruction. But who could blame them? Long hours, bitter cold, and mind-numbing monotony made sleep an ever-present temptation. The very structure of the job almost guaranteed occasional failure. By the late Middle Ages, towns began professionalizing the watch. Instead of relying on unwilling citizens, they hired permanent night guards. Pay was low, but steadier than relying on substitutes. In some places, militias were merged with the watch, creating organized patrols that looked less like sleepy villagers and more like real guards. This shift laid the groundwork for what would later become city police forces. The watch was mocked in life, but honored in memory. Plays like Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing lampooned them as bumbling fools. Yet the very fact they appeared in drama shows their cultural presence. More importantly, their structure: hourly calls, patrol routes, checkpoints. Curfews became the skeleton of modern law enforcement. Today's police owe their origins not to knights or sheriffs, but to those weary men who trudged through the dark, calling, "All's well." Most watchmen lived and died unknown, their names lost in dusty town records, but their impact was immense. They deterred crime, slowed fires, and reassured sleeping citizens that someone, at least, was awake. They were not warriors, but guardians of silence. Their legacy is not glory, but continuity, the slow, patient work of keeping danger at bay, hour by hour, night by night. So, as you imagine the last hour before dawn, a tired watchman leaning on his spear, you are left with a question. Were these men simply placeholders in history's margins, or were they, without recognition, the first thin line between order and chaos in the medieval night? In the Middle Ages, debt was everywhere. Peasants borrowed grain from landlords to survive lean years. Merchants borrowed money to finance trade caravans. Even kings pawned their jewels to fund wars. But unlike today, where debt can stretch across decades, medieval loans were short, sharp, and personal. A promise written on parchment, sealed with wax, could bind a man's life as firmly as chains. For peasants, debt was often a matter of survival. A poor harvest meant borrowing seed for next year. A sick animal meant borrowing money for a replacement. These loans were rarely large, but they came with heavy strings attached. If the borrower failed to repay, he might lose land, tools, or even freedom. Many debtors ended up in prison not for crimes, but for failing to meet obligations as small as a few shillings. To fall into debt was to step onto a slippery slope where every missed payment pulled you deeper. Merchants, too, lived by debt. Trade required loans to buy stock, pay for wagons, and cover tolls. Promissory notes passed between towns, creating webs of obligation. A missed payment in one city could ripple across an entire network. To manage this, merchant guilds enforced strict rules. A man who failed to pay could be banned from trading, his reputation ruined. In a world where honor was currency, defaulting on debt was social death. Medieval laws on debt were brutal. Debtors' prisons filled with men who owed small sums. Families often had to ransom their relatives by selling possessions in some regions. Debtors were publicly shamed, paraded with signs declaring their failure. Others were forced into servitude until they repaid what they owed. Bankruptcy, as we know it today, did not exist. Instead, ruin was personal and visible. The church condemned usury, charging interest as sinful. But the reality was complicated. Loans were necessary, and moneylenders found ways to disguise interest under fees or gifts. This hypocrisy created tension. Priests preached against greed, yet monasteries themselves often acted as lenders, demanding repayment from peasants who worked their lands. Debt was both a moral sin and a practical necessity, leaving borrowers trapped in contradiction. So, as you picture a peasant signing his mark on a parchment loan, or a merchant sealing a promissory note, you must ask, was medieval debt truly about money, or was it about power, binding people together in invisible chains stronger than iron? Debt was more than numbers on parchment. It was leverage. A landlord who lent seed grain could demand loyalty from peasants. A guild master who offered credit could bind apprentices for years. To owe money was not just to owe coin, it was to accept another's authority. The borrower lived under the lender's shadow. Every meal and every harvest a reminder of that dependence. Records show heartbreaking cases. A farmer imprisoned for failing to repay a debt smaller than the value of his ox. A widow forced to give up her children into service because she could not repay her husband's loans. Villages where unpaid debts spread like sickness, each person owing another until the entire community was entangled. Debt rarely stayed with the debtor. Alone, it infected families, spreading burden across generations. For merchants, debt was both lifeblood and poison. Credit allowed long-distance trade to flourish, but one unpaid loan could topple an entire network. A cloth merchant in Flanders might borrow from a banker in Bruges, who in turn borrowed from a financier in Venice. If the cloth failed to sell, the chain of debt snapped, dragging all down with it. These crises spread like ripples. Towns recorded bankruptcies that devastated entire guilds, proving that unpaid debt was as dangerous as fire in a tightly packed city. Debt enforcement was deliberately humiliating. Debtors paraded in the marketplace, wearing signs of shame. Their names were announced by town criers. Some were made to sit in church with ropes around their necks, visible symbols of dishonor. These punishments served a purpose. They warned others not to borrow recklessly, and they reassured lenders that the system protected their rights. But for the debtor, the stain was permanent. Even if the money was later repaid, the humiliation lingered. The church condemned usury in sermons, but could not avoid lending altogether. Monasteries often lent grain or money to peasants, demanding repayment in kind. Bishops themselves borrowed heavily to fund building projects or crusades. This contradiction bred resentment. Peasants accused monasteries of greed, while moneylenders accused priests of hypocrisy. The tension between faith and finance became one of the defining features of medieval economic life. Perhaps the most frightening part of medieval debt was its self-feeding cycle. A peasant who borrowed to survive one bad harvest often had to borrow again the next year, just to repay the first loan. Soon, his debts exceeded his income. He might sell tools, then land, then freedom. Whole families slid downward into servitude, bound not by chains, but by ink. So, as you imagine a debtor sitting in the marketplace with a rope around his neck, shamed before his neighbors, you must ask, was debt a tool of survival in hard times, or was it the slowest, quietest plague of all, eating away at dignity and freedom, one unpaid coin at a time? Debt was private, but its consequences were public. Entire villages sometimes collapsed under the weight of unpaid obligations. If too many peasants fell into arrears, landlords saw fields go untended. If too many merchants defaulted, markets slowed to a crawl. In this way, unpaid debts were like an infection, starting with one man, spreading until the whole body of the town was weakened. Chroniclers wrote of villages abandoned because, in these cases, debt was more destructive than plague. Debt even fueled uprisings. In peasant revolts across Europe, complaints about taxes and rents often included grievances about loans. During the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, rebels destroyed debt records, storming into manors, and burning account rolls. To destroy the parchment was to destroy the obligation itself. For those bound by ink, fire was the only freedom in cities. Angry mobs sometimes attacked moneylenders directly, blaming them for their misery. These violent outbursts were rare, but they reveal just how explosive the plague of unpaid debts could be by the late Middle Ages. Rulers began experimenting with debt relief. Some cities offered limited protections for debtors, preventing total ruin. A few kings declared moratoriums during famines or wars, halting collections to prevent unrest. But these reforms were patchy, inconsistent, and often motivated by politics rather than compassion. The system remained harsh, and debt continued to ensnare millions. Only in the Renaissance did the first true concept of bankruptcy appear, especially in Italian trading cities. Instead of rotting in prison, some merchants were allowed to declare insolvency, surrender assets, and start again. It was a small mercy born from necessity in the world of international trade. But for peasants and laborers, such protections came centuries later. The medieval obsession with debt left a deep legacy. It shaped laws, created systems of record-keeping, and even influenced language. To this day, we speak of being in someone's debt, not only financially, but morally. The shame of default, the burden of obligation, the power imbalance between lender and borrower, all trace their roots to those parchment notes written centuries ago. So as you close the ledger, with its neat rows of numbers and names, you are left with a final question. Was medieval debt the necessary glue that held society together, or was it a quiet plague, more feared and more enduring than any disease? In medieval Europe, cloth was more than clothing. It was wealth. Rolls of wool and linen served as collateral for loans, dowries for marriage, and tribute for kings. A peasant's cloak, patched and worn, represented survival. A merchant's bolt of dyed wool could mean fortune, because cloth was so valuable. Its production and sale became one of the most tightly controlled and most frequently cheated trades in the medieval world. Every town had its cloth guilds, weavers, fullers, dyers, and merchants, each claiming their piece of the process. The guilds were meant to protect quality and fairness. They inspected looms, set prices, and punished dishonest sellers. But guilds also protected their own. They banned outsiders, fixed prices, and kept secrets jealously. For ordinary buyers, the guild system meant you paid what the guild demanded, whether or not the cloth was worth it, despite inspections. Cloth sellers had endless ways to cheat short measure, folding bolts so they looked longer than they were, false weave, using fewer threads per inch, so fabric wore thin quickly, cheap mixing, blending wool with inferior fibers like goat hair, then passing it off as pure dye deception, using cheaper dyes that faded after a few washes, but selling them as costly colors. These tricks weren't spectacular frauds, they were quiet cheats, small enough to pass, large enough to profit. Dyes were especially deceptive. True scarlet, made from imported Kermes insects, was staggeringly expensive, but local dyers found ways to mimic it with cheaper roots and minerals. The result looked brilliant at first, then dulled quickly. Only the wealthy could afford cloth that kept its color. The poor wore garments that faded fast, their dull tones marking them as lower class. In this way, Cheating with dyes didn't just save money, it reinforced social hierarchy. For the ordinary buyer, few could truly judge thread count or dye quality. They relied on guild seals stamped on bolts, a mark that was supposed to guarantee honesty, but was often abused. You could leave the market proudly carrying your new tunic fabric, only to discover months later that it frayed or faded. By then, you must ask, was this fabric a symbol of prosperity, or just another trap woven as carefully as the cloth itself? Guilds claimed to ensure quality, but in practice, they acted as monopolies. To sell cloth in a town, you often had to be a member of the guild. Outsiders were banned, and fines were heavy for those who tried to bypass the system. This meant prices were not set by competition, but by agreement. If the guild decided a bolt of wool cost a certain amount, then every buyer paid it, rich or poor. It was protection for guild members, but entrapment for customers. Rulers quickly realized the wealth hidden in cloth. Kings levied customs on exports. Town councils imposed taxes on every dyed piece. Even the church claimed tithes on cloth sales, arguing that garments were part of a household's harvest. This turned a single tunic into a long chain of hidden costs. By the time it reached a buyer, it had passed through so many hands, weaver, fuller, dyer, guild, taxman, that the price was inflated beyond recognition. Dyes became not just decoration, but law. In many regions, sumptuary laws dictated who could wear certain colors. Deep blues and scarlets were reserved for nobles, while peasants were expected to wear undyed wool or dull browns. Guilds enforced these rules, fining or confiscating garments that broke them. This turned clothing into a visible mark of class, and it allowed dyers to charge staggering prices for restricted hues, even when cheaper imitations existed. Guilds worked to suppress them, another form of cheating, but one dressed up as morality. Some towns built entire reputations on their cloth. Flanders became famous for fine wool, Florence for its dyes, England for heavy blood, but with fame came fraud. Sellers in lesser towns tried to pass off their cloth as Flemish or Florentine, stamping false marks on bolts. Guild inspectors railed against this, but the practice thrived. Buyers always preferred a name brand, even if it was counterfeit. For ordinary people, cloth expenses dominated household budgets. A family might save for months to buy new material for winter cloaks. A bride's dowry often included bolts of cloth, and yet disappointment was common. Colors faded, fabric tore, seams unraveled. Behind every tunic or cloak was the suspicion that someone, somewhere in the chain, had cheated. So as you imagine guildmasters in their halls, stamping seals onto bolts of fabric with solemn ceremony, you must ask, were they guardians of quality or weavers of a monopoly that trapped both buyer and seller in endless threads of control? Guilds made a show of punishing cloth fraud, mostly to prove they still held power. A dyer caught watering down colors might have his vats dumped into the street. A weaver who cut corners on thread counts could be fined or banned from the market. In some towns, bolts of fraudulent cloth were burned publicly, a spectacle meant to warn others, but enforcement was uneven. Wealthy merchants often escaped punishment, while small craftsmen were made examples of. The system was less about fairness and more about preserving appearances. By the late Middle Ages, the grip of the guilds began to weaken. Expanding trade networks brought in cloth from far beyond local towns, from England, Italy, even the Middle East. Merchants discovered they could bypass guild restrictions by trading directly across borders. Powerful trading leagues like the Hanseatic merchants made their own rules, undermining guild monopolies. As new markets opened, the old system of sealed bolts and rigid inspections began to crack. The guilds still existed, but their ability to control every stitch diminished despite decline. The impact of the cloth trade lingered. Colors remained symbols of wealth and class for centuries. Scarlet cloaks, blue mantles, and green tunics marked rank in ways that survived well into the Renaissance. Even today, the echoes remain. Luxury fashion houses guard their designs with guild-like secrecy, and brand names act as modern seals of quality or deception. The logic of the cloth guild never truly disappeared. Behind it all were the weavers, dyers, and fullers whose names rarely survive. They bent over looms in cramped houses, stirred vats of reeking dye, and trudged to guild halls with their rolls. Their labor clothed kings and peasants alike, yet their voices are silent. The guild records that survive tell us about rules and punishments, but in the threads themselves, frayed, faded, patched, we glimpse the daily struggle of the people who made them. So, as you hold a bolt of medieval cloth, bright at first, but already fading at the edges, you are left with a question. Was this fabric the proud product of skill and tradition, or was it the carefully woven lie of a system designed to profit from every thread? In a world where coins were scarce and kingdoms were always short on money, rulers hunted for new ways to squeeze revenue from their subjects. Land was already taxed, markets were already taxed, salt was already taxed. What else was left? The answer, astonishingly, was the very walls of your house. Windows and fireplaces, visible to any tax collector, became the perfect targets. It was simple logic. The more windows you had, the wealthier you must be. The more fireplaces you burned, the more comfort you enjoyed. And so, light and warmth themselves became taxable luxuries. Collectors went from house to house, counting panes of glass, or even simple wooden shutters. In cities, inspectors peered up at facades, tallying openings one by one for the poor, who lived in single-room cottages with no glass at all. The tax might seem negligible, but for townsfolk with larger homes, the cost grew steep. Every extra opening for air and light carried an invisible price. This gave birth to a strange architectural trend. Bricked-up windows. Many families, desperate to avoid extra fees, literally walled over openings. Some of those bricked frames can still be seen today in old European buildings, silent monuments to forgotten taxes. If windows brought light, fireplaces brought warmth, and they too were taxed. Inspectors entered homes, counting hearths and chimneys. A family with multiple fireplaces paid more, regardless of whether they could actually afford fuel for them. This burden hit hardest in colder regions. Imagine being taxed for every place you could light a fire, even as your children shivered. Many households limited themselves to a single hearth, crowding into one smoky room all winter long. Few taxes stirred more bitterness than these. People could accept tolls on roads or duties on salt. Those seemed tied to trade. But a tax on windows felt like a tax on air itself. A tax on fireplaces felt like a tax on survival. Songs, jokes, and angry sermons mocked rulers who demanded money for light and warmth. In some villages, collectors were chased away with stones. So, as you imagine a cold medieval winter, smoke curling from a single hearth while shuttered windows block the daylight, you must ask, were these taxes clever ways to measure wealth, or cruel levies that turned comfort itself into a privilege of the rich? Rulers claimed these taxes were fair because they targeted the visible rich. Land taxes were harder to assess, but windows and fireplaces were easy to count. Inspectors could see them from the street or step inside and tally hearths. Officials argued that if a family had the luxury of multiple chimneys or glass windows, they could afford to pay more. In theory, it was a kind of progressive taxation. In practice, it punished ordinary townsfolk who lived in modest but solid homes. Collectors became a hated sight. They wandered alleys, craning their necks to count upper windows, or barged into kitchens to tally hearths. People accused them of spying, of prying into private homes. In some regions, rumors spread that inspectors kept notes on who lived where, fueling fears of broader control. It was taxation made visible, and therefore, taxation that could not be ignored. Resistance took many forms: bricked-up windows, families sealed openings with stone or wood to reduce their taxable count. This left homes darker and more airless, worsening health. Hidden hearths. Some families disguised fireplaces, covering them when inspectors arrived. Others built illegal chimneys in back walls. Outright refusal in villages. Collectors were sometimes chased away or beaten, especially in harsh winters, when paying for warmth felt unbearable. Each act of defiance showed the resentment simmering beneath these levies. Ironically, the taxes harmed the very people they were meant to manage. Darkened houses without ventilation bred dampness and disease. Families crowding around a single taxed hearth inhaled smoke day and night. Medical records from the time describe coughing fits, eye infections, and childhood sickness linked to poor air and cramped, smoky rooms. The king's tax policies reached directly into people's lungs. Even today, old towns bear scars of these taxes. Rows of houses with suspiciously bricked windows still stand in England, France, and parts of Germany, relics of a time when light was too expensive. Chimney clusters tell similar stories, sometimes abandoned halfway up a wall, built and then abandoned when taxation rose. What looks like quirky architecture was often a desperate attempt to balance survival with the taxman's demands. So as you walk past a medieval street of crooked houses, their windows bricked and their chimneys stunted, you must ask, did these taxes truly measure wealth, or did they turn homes into silent prisons of darkness and smoke? Unlike many medieval levies, window and fireplace taxes refused to die quickly. They were easy to count, easy to enforce, and endlessly profitable in France. Versions of the fireplace tax lasted into the 18th century. In England, the infamous window tax persisted from the 17th century all the way until the mid to 1800s. Generations lived and died under these levies, long after their medieval origins had been forgotten by then. glass windows were more common, which only deepened resentment. A symbol of progress had become a burden. Opponents mocked these taxes as absurd, a literal levy on light and air. Pamphlets railed against governments that forced families to brick up their windows. Politicians argued that the laws worsened health by depriving homes of fresh air. The taxes became shorthand for tyranny, cited in speeches and petitions. They showed how far rulers would go to squeeze coin from their subjects. Eventually, mounting resentment and public health arguments forced governments to abolish them. By the 19th century, new forms of taxation on income, property, and trade replaced the old hearth and window counts. That the relief was enormous. Families reopened their bricked windows, let light pour back in, and built chimneys freely again. But the bitterness lingered. Even today, the legacy is visible. Walk through old European towns, and you'll see bricked-over windows, some neatly done, others clumsily patched. They are silent witnesses to centuries of taxation. In some houses, fireplaces remain oddly clustered or abandoned, evidence of families once balancing warmth with cost. Architecture itself remembers the taxman. The window and hearth taxes taught rulers and subjects alike a lasting lesson. People resent taxes most when they touch daily life directly. A levy on merchants or markets could be tolerated, but a levy on fire, air, and light. That lesson echoes in modern debates, where governments tread carefully around taxes seen as intruding into the home. So, as you stand before an old stone house, its upper windows bricked and silent, you are left with a final question. Were these taxes clever tools of revenue, or symbols of how easily rulers can turn the comforts of home into instruments of control? For peasants, grain wasn't just food, it was life itself. Every loaf of bread, every pot of porridge, every mug of ale began with the annual harvest. Grain was also currency. Rents were paid in sacks of barley. Taxes were measured in bushels of wheat. A bride's dowry might include grain, and a family's wealth was often judged by the fullness of its bins. Because of this, peasants learned to measure with obsessive care. A single missing handful could mean less food in winter. Peasants didn't have precise scales or printed rulers. Instead, they relied on simple tools. The bushel basket, passed from hand to hand, often disputed for its size. The wooden rod or stick, used to mark the depth of grain in a bin. Handfuls and scoops, calibrated not by science but by experience. These tools varied from village to village, creating endless arguments. A bushel in one town might hold more or less than a bushel in another. Harvest was both joy and terror. Families brought in sheaves of barley, threshing them carefully, then storing the kernels in wooden bins or clay jars. Each evening, peasants counted and recounted their stores. How many bushels could be spared for rent? How much seed must be saved for spring? How much could be eaten without running out before the next harvest? This was arithmetic, done not with ink, but with hunger. Overseeing it all were the Lord's stewards, who collected rents in kind. A peasant might haul a sack of barley to the manor, only to watch the steward measure it with the Lord's own basket, often larger than the peasants. Complaints filled records, peasants accusing stewards of cheating, stewards accusing peasants of shorting their dues. Behind every sack of grain was a quiet battle over fairness. Perhaps the most oppressive part was the constant anxiety. A poor harvest meant calculating survival down to the handful. Families stretched bread with peas, beans, or acorns. Some boiled thin gruel, rationing their barley cup by cup, every spilled kernel on the floor. Every rat in the granary felt like a personal tragedy. Two peasants counting grain was not just economy, it was the rhythm of existence. So, as you imagine a peasant family crouched in their barn, tallying sacks by lantern light, you must ask,